Hello and welcome to The Loop. I'm Zoe Morton, an Associate Director in RSM's Financial Services Regulation Team and a member of RSM's Financial Services Consumer Duty Working Group, where we monitor the impact of the new consumer duty on firms through our advisory and assurance work with clients in this area. In this episode of The Loop, we will analyse the new consumer duty rules that were introduced on the 31st of July this year. These represent the biggest regulatory change programme for financial services since the Treating Customers Fairly, or TCF principles, were introduced back in 2006. Over 3 months in, we are looking at whether financial services providers are fully on board with the new rules. Here to help with any firms still struggling is RSM's resident consumer duty expert, Michael McCormick, along with George Houston, Group Compliance Officer from Mattioli Woods, joining us today. Mattioli Woods is a wealth management and employee benefits service provider. And George will be helping to explain how Mattioli Woods has approached implementation of the consumer duty rules today. So the core aim of the new consumer duty rules is to ensure consumers understand financial products, so they in turn can make informed decisions to ensure that products and services meet those consumer needs, but also to ensure that a fair price is charged for the products and services that consumers are offered. Despite the new rules already being enforced now for a little while, many financial services firms are still getting to grips with what this all means. So saying that, Michael, perhaps if you could just start by introducing to us what these new rules are and why they were introduced.
Thanks, Zoe. So a bit much like what you said, this is probably one of the most significant regulatory overhauls in the last 10, 20 years since probably TCF, with the aim of setting a higher standard of consumer protections and to deliver better outcomes for customers. So ultimately, the duty is made up of a collaboration of cross-cutting rules, which a firm must act in good faith towards retail consumers, avoid foreseeable harm to retail consumers, and to enable and support retail consumers to pursue their financial objectives. The other part of this is a consumer principle. They've introduced a brand new consumer principle, which is a firm must act to deliver good outcomes for retail clients. And 4 outcomes being product and services, price and value, consumer understanding, and consumer support. As for the why the consumer duty is important, it comes down to the fact that the FCA want to increase the confidence and integrity of the financial system, which historically, since the financial crisis, has been pretty low. And they evidenced this through their Financial Lives survey, which was published recently. So they want to ensure that there's a great level of protection and better outcomes for consumers, which in turn they believe will increase those trust levels. They're putting on the onus back onto the firms to begin evidencing this. This greater level of consumer protection is particularly important now in a time when consumers are facing particular pressures, such as the cost of living crisis, that will have a direct impact on the decisions that they're making when it comes to their financial life. So ultimately, firms will need to work with their consumers to better understand their needs, identify vulnerabilities, and provide support to achieve their financial objectives.
And could you talk to us around who the new consumer duty rules apply to?
The rules apply pretty much to all FCA-regulated firms that have a material influence over or determine the retail outcomes. And this includes firms that manufacture or provide products and services to retail clients, even if they don't have a direct relationship with the end customer. And it will also apply to distributors, so those who provide financial service products on behalf of a third-party lender, for example. It also covers both the regulated activities and unregulated activities that are ancillary to the regulated activities. We're using activities quite a bit, but ultimately these are things like product design and the customer services aspect of the services that many companies provide. Those will also be brought into scope of the duty.
I think that's a really important aspect because these are aspects that perhaps might not have been considered by firms previously. So it's really making sure that chain is consistent throughout the life cycle for the consumer, but also the manufacturer, the client-facing firm that the customer's dealing with, but anybody essentially that's any firm that's involved in that chain.
Yeah, it's ultimately anywhere where there's a sort of a customer touch point. They need to make sure that they're doing things in the best interest of those customers to give good outcomes.
And that's a really great segue to introduce us to George. It's great to have you with us today, George. Perhaps if you could start by explaining to us what you do and how the rules have affected the Mattioli Woods business.
Thanks for having me. From Mattioli Woods' perspective, we have the unique challenge that we have an advisory business as well as we are a manufacturer of our own products, SaaS, and we also manufacture our own investment solutions. So in terms of my role within that, I'm compliance oversight for the firm, and I work across the business historically very closely with our executive team, which has actually enabled my life to be a lot easier from a consumer duty perspective. So in terms of our business, it's always been a client-centric business. The fact that we have an advisory function allows us to be very close to clients, to be able to pick up on things like vulnerabilities, to pick up on how clients react to different types of propositions. But the biggest challenge, I would say, for and anyone I've spoken to about it is that it's that proof that you're doing what you're doing. You intuitively know that you're doing, but this is a data-led piece of work now for us. It's how do you gather the data that allows you to demonstrate those great outcomes for clients? And that's been a big challenge, but actually we identified it as a big opportunity very early, and it was a big opportunity to take a step back, look at what we do and how we do it, and see how we can improve on that. And that process, without giving a punt for RSM's services, it was helped by a very early audit that we had from RSM as our third-party internal audit function, who were able to kind of tell us what we weren't seeing, because sometimes you don't know what you don't know. So it was a useful tool that we used to iterate the plan we had. Now, the plan that we had was essentially sponsored by our senior independent non-executive director, who's now the new chair of the organisation. So I got very early, very high-level engagement from her and from Ian Mattioli as CEO and the rest of the executive to allow me to ask the questions we needed to ask. And I think that's been a very healthy thing for our business because it's allowed us to reflect. I now regularly get emails which could be about a completely different subject, but which reference consumer duty and client outcomes. So I can see it, the challenge of having it ingrained within the business was not as big as some may have found, because that was already there within the business in terms of focusing on client outcomes. So it's been an interesting couple of years, really, in the run up to it. And from the very off, I also recognise that if you have a good product governance structure within the business, that helps massively from a consumer duty perspective, because you are essentially kicking the tires before a product is launched, and then understanding what impact that product can have from a client outcome.
I think you've made some really good points there, George. Thank you. I mean, one of the ones I perhaps wanted to touch on was something that Michael and I have also talked about, which is around the sort of culture throughout the organisation and that senior buy-in in terms of the tone from the top and the leadership aspects that you've just mentioned. And you've talked about the fact that the chief executive at Mattioli Woods has been involved in discussions, that there's that buy-in across the organisation. Michael, have you got any thoughts around what perhaps good looks like in that space, and perhaps any reflections on where that perhaps isn't working as well as it could be for some organisations?
I think the both of you have nailed the key points that I would have brought up, particularly from the observations I've seen working with some of the clients that we've dealt with. I think from the cultural standpoint, 100%, it's something I'm seeing quite frequently now. And I think it's something that the FCA wants to sort of get embedded across organizations, but it's struggling to articulate how firms should actually do that. And I think this is the interesting point around culture, is it's not something that can be articulated straight through words or provide a standard framework. It's something that needs to be ingrained within your business from all levels. That starts from the top of the business, where there is buy-in at all different levels, and they're working together for that common goal of delivering positive outcomes. You naturally see a progression towards what good looks like within the business in terms of designing fantastic frameworks to establishing what good MI is that they need to pull together. But I think a common issue that I identified is clients' understanding of the applicability of the duty to their specific business model. I think some clients have found it hard to decipher the guidance that was provided. I have an example of a client I worked with is an electrical goods store. Their main bread and butter is providing electrical goods to consumers, but they also provide as a distributor a third-party product, so a lending product to help customers, which is in the good interest of customers, to help spread the cost of things or to buy it now and pay back through a lending mechanism. That brings them within scope of the duty, and they didn't understand how that applied to their business model. And then the FCA's own survey came out and pinpointed, well, actually, retail finance is a sector that is significantly behind the curve in their understanding of the duty. So trying to help businesses understand the applicability from the outset is key. I think that's something that many firms are trying to get to grips with now, and the FCA is certainly coming out recently with the letter for wealth management and stockbroking sector. Nisha, one of the directors from the FCA, recently gave a speech talking about what this means for different businesses. So it's out there trying to bring awareness to this.
Yeah, I think your point about culture that I would make, that what I've certainly found is striking the right tone at the top is actually the easy thing to do, because it's what you should expect of senior managers within a business. However, the most pleasing thing for me has been the engagement I've had at every single level of the organisation. I'll give you a great example. I got an email on Monday, which was essentially about, might be a little bit of an issue here. We've got somebody who's considering transferring away from you, and they are talking about the costs of the product that they're in. So I'm going to start to review the correspondence, and it became apparent that there was a completely different reason for the individual to transfer away. But what was missed was some incredibly good feedback on the outcomes that we'd delivered for the client over the years. The client had actually said to the client relationship manager, "You've helped me do this, 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 and this." And that's the kind of feedback that actually we sometimes miss. We also were very lucky. We had a meeting with the FCA in advance of the consumer duty, and they helped us understand where they were coming from a voice of customer perspective about surveys and so on. And they acknowledged that part of the problem with surveys is that you're more likely to fill out a survey if you're discontented rather than contented. But you need that balance. So what I'm trying to do is to make sure that I get a proper contextual balance in the feedback that we get, whether that be through client surveys, but just emails like that. I need to see emails like that. Our executive needs to see emails like that, because that gives you affirmation. Yes, you're doing some stuff right, but also that there could be some things in there as indicators that need to be looked at from a consumer duty perspective.
I think that ties in perfectly to the other area where I've noticed some issues, which is developing those frameworks to like a consistent feedback loop. How do you monitor the outcomes for consumers, and how do you set up a framework to pull that into readable management information that can be discussed, challenged throughout the business? I think Nisha Roy, the director of cross-cutting policy and strategy at the FCA, named her speech that the consumer duty is not once and done. I think that naming in itself is a good indicator that this shouldn't be treated as a tick box exercise, rather something that needs to be embedded throughout the business. And taking examples just like what you gave of receiving those kinds of emails and spotting where customers have communicated that they're actually achieving a positive outcome. If there isn't a formalized framework in place to collate that data and transfer it up the line so that the management, like the board or the executive or compliance or audit committees, can look at that and say, well, if that's working well there, let's consider the useful points of that to apply it to different parts of the business. Yeah. That's demonstrating to the FCA in an evidential format that we're complying with the duty, if you can design that kind of framework. The FCA is really pushing for firms to stretch themselves and not just say, well, we collect complaints data and we look at surveys, but push themselves to say, well, what data do we have in-house? Look at all spectrums of data. If it's advisors that are reaching out to clients on a face-to-face basis or relationship management basis, what's the anecdotal feedback they're getting from those conversations? How can we capture that and push that into a dashboard that can be reviewed on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, it's a real challenge to how do you measure someone sleeping well at night because their financial affairs are in order? It's a really difficult thing to get your head around as to how you capture that. In some ways, we're fortunate because we do encourage our consultants to have as close a relationship with their clients as possible. And capturing their satisfaction is going to be, and I think across the industry, it will be one of the biggest challenges we have. But I think we can. As you say, it's having the net that captures those little emails, and then finding a way of demonstrating that in a data pack.
I would agree with that, George, and I think that's based on the work that we've done so far with our clients. I think it's fair to say that kind of correlation of the data that exists across the organisation, it's absolutely there, but it's how to bring that together and really make the management information as robust as possible. But also, I know from speaking to clients that the consumer outcomes piece and what do clients really think, what do customers really think, is an area that I think for some firms there's an admission that there's still work to be done in that area, and that's one of the challenging aspects of the duty.
Yeah, and I think Nisha's speech was interesting from the perspective of, this is here to stay, but also made it very clear that if needed, the regulator will bare their teeth. And I think that's a striking message for everyone. I believe that overall, the advisory market and the wealth management market in particular is sound. And I think most advisors absolutely have clients' interests at the heart of what they do. But equally, one of the big challenges we have across the piece is making sure that you identify where there is potential harm. And I think that, again, comes back to good governance on the part of the manufacturers of the products, but high expectations of us as advisors on how we then convey those products which are suitable to clients in the best way possible. And that's actually going to be one of the big challenges for me from an advice perspective, because if you went to any advisor at the minute and you wanted to do your ISA for this year, how many pages would your report be that you get from them? And at what point in that report would you lose interest? Because there's so much regulatory stuff in there. And that's one of the things that we're challenging ourselves on at the minute, is how do we make our communications with clients the best they possibly can be whilst executing our responsibility from a regulatory perspective as well.
Can I ask as well, George, just in terms of that topic, has anything changed as yet in terms of the level of interaction with clients, for example? Because I imagine there's a degree of some clients that will want to speak to the business relatively often, others that perhaps want to maybe have that conversation with their advisor once a year. Has the business at this stage thought about frequency of interactions?
It's just the way we operate as a business, is that you're as close to your clients as your clients need you to be. And we've got to accept that some clients only want to see you once a year. But ultimately, the challenge is to make sure that every interaction you have is meaningful and adds value. I think what we're doing is recognising it more. Sometimes you don't give yourself credit for the things that you do. So we do give ourselves a little bit more reflection time to take stock and, well, what have we actually delivered for a set of clients or a particular client. And as compliance officer, that's what I encourage.
Good to hear, George. And I think that comes back to a point you made at the outset, which is this is perhaps not changing the way in which the business does what it does with its clients, its consumers, but it's back to that, the demonstrating of that and the evidencing of that, and that perhaps that for some firms there'll be more to do in terms of increasing the level of transparency around client interactions.
I think that's the crux of it. From the evidential standpoint, is lots of companies, particularly if you're looking at the wealth sector, it's part of their business model to have great relationships with their clients and deliver what their clients want. I think what the FCA is pushing, particularly in the wealth sector at the moment, to do is that self-reflection piece. Sometimes the way in which these business models were designed and the way in which it was servicing customers before may now need to evolve. Having that point of self-reflection and then updating policies, guidance documents, procedural documents, discussing those in meetings and capturing proper minutes that articulate what you've decided moving forward. That is your evidential basis. And I think the FCA wants to see those discussions regularly coming up in appropriate committees or at the board. If you've got a consumer duty forum, those kinds of forums is where the FCA wants to see ongoing discussion, ongoing review of data, be it anecdotal comments from your advisors or to looking at actual metrics, so the quantitative stuff that you can pull together from MI.
Yeah, and consumer duty now becomes business as usual within our business. So Zoe attends our audit committee on behalf of RSM, and a standing item is, all of the things that we observed as a team from a consumer duty perspective in our implementation plan. It's there in the mother and father of all spreadsheets, and we update the board on all of those key aspects as we go along. So it's always a standing item that feeds all the way up to the board. That's how you get it to live and breathe within the business and get the comfort that we're doing the right things. We'll not always get everything right, but it's the self-reflection that allows you to pick that up.
Michael, perhaps if you could talk to us around what might happen for businesses that perhaps don't comply with the rules.
That's an interesting area. I think, George, you mentioned before that the FCA, where they find issues, they will start to bare their teeth, as it were. The FCA has in place its supervisory strategy, which you can find online as the approach to supervision and the approach to enforcement documents. They ultimately set out the framework that the FCA follows when it comes to applying its supervisory model and enforcement model on firms. So ultimately, they'll be following that when it comes to chasing down firms that haven't necessarily complied. I think what firms can expect to see is those who have named supervisors inside the FCA, they're referred to as fixed firms. They will, as part of their ongoing supervisory engagements with the FCA, be required to provide updates and relevant evidence to demonstrate how they're complying with the rules, where there are examples of those firms falling short, or if there's negative outcomes reported for consumers. And then they can expect to be subject to things like Section 166 skilled persons reviews. In some of the more extreme cases, they can probably experience things like VREX and OIREX, which are basically going to be told you have to stop taking on new clients or stop a particular service. And when it's really been escalated, if there's some serious gross misconduct, they can expect it to be pushed forward into enforcement, where you can expect a much more robust investigation to take place, which will be very uncomfortable for some firms. And they result in things like fines, censures, prohibitions from accessing financial services as a director in the future for those who are held personally accountable. But for those who are slightly smaller firms who may not have a fixed name supervisor, they can expect in some cases to be contacted under Section 165 information requests to form part of multi-firm pieces of work or thematic reviews, where the FCA will select a sample within a specific sector and ask specific pieces of information of those firms. So they may, post July 2024, ask for things like the annual board attestation for the firm to demonstrate how they've assessed their compliance with the new consumer duty. But much like the fixed firms, where there's gross misconduct identified or if there's poor outcomes identified, then they can expect much of the same. Section 166s all the way through to enforcement, fines, censures and prohibitions.
You've touched on the annual attestation, Michael. That's obviously something that is coming into the new year. What do we know about that, and perhaps what does good look like around that? And George, if you have any thoughts around what the business is doing to prepare.
Sure. So this year, July 31st, 2023, there was just the normal attestation. It was for the boards to review the implementation plan and assess that the progress had been made to bring them into compliance with the rules. For next year, the expectation is that it would be less of a attestation, like a signed document, say we attest that this is all done, but more a robust report that does a full end-to-end assessment, a bit like an MLRO report or a compliance report that you get on an annual basis. Those would be good examples to look at in terms of how you would frame it, the sort of attention and resource that you'd have to put towards producing this. So it should demonstrate that you have looked across your business, identified the various sort of client and customer segment groups, looked at how you are measuring and assessing outcomes for each of those client and segment groups, but then also where you've identified risks to complying with the duty, what is your firm doing to mitigate this? I think once you've got all of those documented in a report that can outline for the board where there are material issues that are being addressed and how you can evidence achieving positive outcomes for consumers, you are going a long way to demonstrating good practice in producing your annual report. And it's important to mention, as I said earlier, the FCA will request these reports post July 2024 of some firms, and they are expecting that those reports will be provided within short order. They've made clear that they expect when they request it, you might get a day or two to turn it around.
So in other words, it's really important to be prepared.
Very.
That's where we anticipated that level of scrutiny potentially being asked of us, and that's why we try to bring everything together in one big action plan. That's consistently reviewed by all of the board committees, actually. It's in Risk and Compliance Committee, it's in Audit Committee, and then up to the PLC board itself. Because ultimately, by July next year, I need every single board member to be in a position of being fully informed as to what they're attesting.
Is there anything else we've perhaps not covered that was a requirement in terms of ensuring compliance with the duty?
I think one important point to make of it's not necessarily under the scope yet, but it is coming as of 31st July 2024, is all closed book products will be brought into scope. So closed book being books of business that are no longer open to retail clients now, but they are currently still servicing or administering those services to historical clients. The FCA purposefully gave industry an additional year to bring those legacy books into compliance with the duty because they recognise the complexity behind them. Some of those products, it's difficult to try and map those under the rules now when historically those practices were acceptable, and businesses should be well underway in carrying out their gap analysis and now implementing the remediation steps to get those ready for compliance. So making sure that there is buy-in across the business to get that across the line by the 31st of July 2024 will be very, very important.
How do you see that working in practice, just reflecting on the fact that for the 2023 deadline, implementation plans were put in place for the end of October 2022? What does that look like going forward from your perspective, Michael? What do you anticipate?
I think the important point was that they were giving an additional 12 months. The FCA expected firms to be prepared for the open book products by July 2023, but work to map out where the risks are, incorporate the steps that would need to be taken in the implementation plan should have been done within that 2022 period. I think what you will find is those firms who have fallen behind or have sort of deprioritized the closed book part to focus heavily on the open book part of the business may find themselves in a bit of a difficulty when it comes to being ready for 2024. I think in those instances, the FCA has been pretty clear that it's within your best interest to self-report under Principle 11. So you can submit a SUP 15 notification or speak to your named supervisor just to let them know that you are working towards it, you have a plan, and you can demonstrate by showing them your implementation plan, but you are still behind in certain aspects because of either it's going to take a particularly long time to understand the risk within a particular book, or if there is a resource issue, or if there are other challenges that you're encountering. The FCA wants to see that you're taking a best endeavours approach, and doing that means being transparent.
And George, from Mattioli Woods' perspective, how is the business preparing for that closed book analysis?
Already well underway. It had started before the July deadline, but we were behind. Never going to get it done by the end of July this year. But we have a limited number of areas that we have to look at, and it is things like acquired books. Some, where Mattioli Woods has perhaps been asked to go in as a provider of last resort, and with some failed providers. So we're looking at that through the same lens that we're looking at everything else.
What do we think the future holds? Do we think there will be more changes coming down the line?
I wouldn't articulate it as future changes, but I think the FCA will continue to articulate its expectations for particular sectors or particular parts of business models. So again, in the recent letter that was published, the Dear CEO letter to the wealth management and stockbrokers, you'll see reference to financial crime controls. Now, that doesn't immediately strike people's mind as an area that would fall under consumer duty, but the way it's been articulated is that if your customers are susceptible to falling for scams or are losing money due to fraud or other failings within your financial crime controls, that is ultimately a negative outcome for your consumers. Therefore, the expectation is to bring your financial crime controls up to standards under the duty. Now, likewise for the identification and treatment of vulnerable customers, that was brought out in a 2021 piece of guidance separate from the consumer duty, but is still brought in the consumer duty with an extended scope. So you will see these topical areas being discussed more and more in the future, where they'll pick out specific aspects of business models and saying, here's what we expect of businesses. And that might result in additional work for some firms.
I think they've got the framework right, but the key thing for me is preventing customer harm. And if you start from that basis, then you're not going to go too far wrong along the way if you end up with that goal that you've minimised the risk of any clients being harmed by any of your interactions with them or any of the products that they use. Financial crime, I think you're right. That's, for me, it's squarely a consumer duty matter because it's all about potential for clients to have wrong done to them. And I think that's what we'll get is just iterations, or the lens will be focused on certain areas of how we conduct our business, just to make sure that we're always looking at it from that perspective.
I think that's an important point. It's how you define harm will be, it should be treated like a living exercise. The same way you would look, for example, at cybercrime or cyber-related issues, there is an ever-evolving taxonomy of risks, because cyber professionals, if you want to refer to them as professionals, will consistently come up with innovative ways to breach systems or basically cause harm to infrastructures. The same should be applied towards identifying consumer harm from a consumer duty standpoint. This should be a regularly evolving taxonomy of what does harm look like for consumers in this period or in this section or in this client segment, and what will it look like in 6 months, 12 months, 3 years' time, because that will evolve.
That foreseeable harm is really important, isn't it? It's how reasonably far out can a firm foreseeably see a detrimental impact on the consumer. Just wanted to touch on, Michael, as well, the Dear CEO letter. Really interesting stat that was quoted in there around the volume of firms that claim not to have identified vulnerable customers within their customer client portfolios. That the numbers are fairly staggering. So 49% of portfolio managers and 69% of stockbrokers from the wealth data survey confirmed that they had no vulnerable customers. I mean, that feels like a pretty stark statement to make.
Stark would be an understatement. And I think that's the reason why they put out this letter. I think people need to understand that vulnerable customers, it does not just mean a physical impairment. Vulnerable customers cover things like bereavement. It can cover things like anything that can impact a person's ability to make informed judgments ultimately is a vulnerability. You take the financial crisis or the cost of living crisis that we're experiencing right now, that will put a lot of people that on the cold face of things might not appear vulnerable to a wealth advisor or relationship manager, but suddenly turn them into a vulnerable person because they're under significant stress. And that stress will impair their ability to make an informed judgment on something that the advisor may have reasonably assessed them as being able to make a decision on previously, in the previous years. That ability to consistently push themselves, like we said earlier about keeping a living exercise of assessing what harm looks like, means that they regularly be looking at what does vulnerability mean. I suspect within that large number of stockbrokers and wealth advisors that identify that there were no vulnerable customers, were using an old definition and therefore not identifying what vulnerability means today.
So I guess some of that could come back to the training across an organisation. So how up to speed are wealth advisors in terms of understanding the FCA's expectations around vulnerability?
I would love to know a little bit more granular detail as to who answered what question in that survey, because I find it hard to believe that any wealth manager, advisor, whatever you want to call them, would say no. Could see some investment managers almost not defining what their customer is, or they're defining their customer as the advisor who is then recommending the product to a client. And I wonder whether or not there's been a misunderstanding of what was actually being asked of them. And perhaps the question is have you, when you're designing this product or service, have you considered that at the end of the line, the consumer that actually uses that product could be vulnerable? And what changes have you made to adapt for that vulnerability? Mm-hmm. And it might just be a little bit of a big bit of a misunderstanding if it's that stark. I would like to think that most financial advisors would have been very cognizant of those signs of vulnerability, and also when it comes to vulnerability, that there has to be a judgment made. Someone who is bereaved doesn't automatically make them vulnerable. There has to be a judgment call there, and I speak a lot to our relationship managers and our consultants about this as well. Is that ultimately, you can't make a snap judgment. What you have is an indicator of a potential vulnerability. What you need to then do is overlay your information on top of that to understand whether or not that client, we just need to think about how we deal with that client and adapt your approach accordingly.
Agreed. Thanks, George. So, Michael, is there anything else that you think clients might need to do to prepare for what 24 brings?
I would advise industries across the spectrum in financial services just to keep their eyes and ears open for publications that are being put out by the FCA. Attend any webinars or sessions that the FCA is publishing, because I know that there's one coming up, I think, in December about what's next. And just keeping themselves apprised of the new developments, picking up things like that Dear CEO letter. Even if you're not a wealth manager or stockbroker, there is useful information in there that can still be applicable to your own business models. And where possible, try to engage with people like RSM or other advisors that you're engaging with currently to try and ask some of the questions that maybe you're finding a bit challenging. Because sometimes just having those conversations with another person with a different perspective may help you in the long run.
Thanks, Michael. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Michael and George. It's been really good to hear both of your thoughts on the consumer duty and that insight into what actions your business is taking, George, but also our clients at RSM, Michael. If you would like to contact us and talk all things consumer duty, you can find us on www.rsmuk.com or find our details in the show notes. To stay in the loop, just subscribe to The Loop. We are always keen to hear your views, so please rate us and leave us a review. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode.